بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, the author rahimahullah ta'ala says باب بيان نقصان الإيمان بالمعاصي ونفيه عن المتلبس بالمعصية على إرادة نفي كماله. Says here the mention about the decrease in belief due to sins and its separation from the sinners and loss of its perfection at the time of committing sin. For one reason or another, this chapter heading is missing a number here in the Arabic version along with the English translation. It doesn't have a number, and it says in English 22b. We took chapter which is clearly mentioned as 21 about the various levels of Iman and the virtue of the people of Yemen regarding that. Then came the chapter of clarifying that the deen is nasiha, and that also is missing a number as well in the Arabic here in the English, even though it says chapter 22. Then it says here chapter 22b. Al-Muhim, what's important here is that it says bayanu nuqsan al-imani bil-ma'asi, is that Iman becomes weak, it becomes deficient, it decreases, it falls down, it plummets because of sins. That's the first concept that the author wants to speak on in this chapter. And secondly is those who make these sins, murder, zina, drinking alcohol, unjustly eating the wealth of orphans, fleeing from the battlefield, and things like this, he says that the Iman is negated. That there's total negation of their Iman. And that it doesn't state the Iman is low. It doesn't state that the Iman is weak, deficient. It says that there is no Iman. He has no Iman at the time of performing those acts of disobedience. So this here is another specific concept of Iman according to the people of the Qibla. Ahlul Sunnah, Ahlul Hadith, the Murji'ah, Khawarij, the Mu'tazila, Murji'atul Fuqaha, Ash'aris, Maturidis, etc. What happens when a person makes acts of disobedience? That's the first issue. Number two, how can his Iman be negated while making these sins? Does that mean he's a kafir or what? So this is a specific issue over which the people of the Qibla differ. And the manhaj, the way of Ahlul Hadith, is very clear in this issue. And that is, first and foremost, whatever sin you make, it weakens your Iman. Secondly, the Rasul ﷺ, the way that he spoke and the way that he talked was to negate the Iman of those who perform these acts. Not to say that it's weak and low, but they have no Iman. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are kuffar, but it clearly proves that they are not strong believers, and that they have a basic level of Iman with them, but at any means, it isn't at its highest peak. Khairan inshaAllah. The author says, hadith number 36, hadith Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, anna Nabiya sallallahu alayhi wa sallam قال لا يزني الزاني حين يزني وهو مؤمن ولا يشرب الخمر حين يشربها وهو مؤمن ولا يسرق السارق حين يسرق وهو مؤمن. وزاد في رواية ولا ينتهب نهبة ذات شرف يرفع الناس إليه أبصارهم فيها حين ينتهبها وهو مؤمن. Says here in the translation number 36, narrate Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, the Prophet ﷺ said, an adulterer at the time he is committing illegal sexual intercourse is not a believer. And a person at the time of drinking an alcoholic drink is not a believer. And a thief at the time of stealing is not a believer. Abu Hurairah added in another narration, and he who robs while the people are looking at him is not a believer at the time he is robbing. This hadith clearly shows us that these acts of sin, these kaba'ir, major sins, stealing, drinking khamr, robbery, thievery, things like this, fornication and adultery, they are major acts of ma'asiyah, and whenever the believer falls into them, as if he has no iman, as if he's not a believer at that time. In other words, his obligatory perfection of iman is not being fulfilled. As we have explained, that iman has two types of perfection and two levels of perfection. The first is the level of perfection that every Muslim should strive for and has to strive for. And the second level of perfection is something that is optional, something that is preferable. And we've explained this many times in our series on this book. Whenever iman is negated, then what's meant here is that the believer has failed to do, or failed to strive, or failed to move in the direction of the obligatory perfection. And there is no recommended perfection that one fails to do when his iman is negated. That does not exist. The hadith says, "La yu'minu ahadukum." None of you believes until he loves his brother what he loves for himself. It's obligatory to love for your brother what you love for yourself. And that's a level of perfection of iman that everyone has to strive for. That's not necessarily the case of other levels of iman that are supererogatory and preferable. The believer is this, the believer is that. As we've explained already, let's move forward and not spend too much time on this. So this is what this hadith means. A zani Muslim is still a Muslim. He's still a mu'min, but he isn't a mu'min. In other words, he has the basic level of iman. He has the basic level of Islam, but the strong iman, high iman, is not there at all. Everybody clear on this? And the same applies to those other acts of ma'siyah. Khayran inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The hadith also tells us that zina is haram, such as, or is the same as stealing, drinking, and robbing. And not only are these things haram, but they are major acts of ma'siyah. Khayran inshallah. Let's move on to the next chapter. The author rahimahullah, he says, Babu bayani khisal al-munafiq. He says, chapter 23, the mention of the characteristics of hypocrisy. What are some of the attributes and qualities of nifaq and of the munafiqeen? What are they? How do we know what they are? How can we avoid them and not fall into them? So these khisal are signs of nifaq. Question is then, what type of nifaq? Nifaq of i'tiqad, meaning the person is a kafir on the inside, a heretic who believes not in Allah on the last day, a total fake Muslim, or nifaq al-amal, hypocrisy of action, in which the person believes in Allah, believes in the last day, loves Allah, loves the Rasul, loves the believers, but is weak. His iman is beat down. He's overpowered and overtaken by his lust from time to time, his greed, his haste, his anger, his jealousy, his envy, his loins or her loins, things like this. Does that mean they are munafiqeen? Everybody clear on this? Quote unquote a fake Muslim. In other words, they're not true Muslim in real hardcore meaning of Islam. But they do things, they say things, they don't keep their words. They try to practice, but they make sins, so on and so forth. Khayran inshallah. So we want to get into that when we mention the hadith. What's important here is that this chapter pertains to Kitab al-Iman from the aspect of nifaq and iman are like water and oil. Cats and dogs, they just don't mix, they don't get along. They do not unite. They do not come upon the same platter at one banquet. So therefore, when we're talking about iman, its increase, its decrease, we have to talk about nifaq, because that's something that pertains to iman, whether it is based off of sins, a person hiding kufr, etc. Khayran inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the hadith, it says here, khisal al-munafiq, attributes, characteristics of hypocrisy or of the hypocrite, and not of hypocrisy. So that's a more sound translation. It says munafiq and not nifaq. Hadith number 37, Hadith Abdullah bin Amr radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: أربع من كن فيه كان منافقا خالصا، ومن كانت فيه خصلة منهن كانت فيه خصلة من النفاق حتى يدعها، إذا اؤتمن خان، وإذا حدث كذب، وإذا عاهد غدر، وإذا خاصم فجر. Says narrated Abdullah bin Amr radiyallahu anhuma, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whoever has the following four characteristics will be a pure hypocrite. And whoever has one of the following four characteristics will have one characteristic of hypocrisy, unless and until he gives it up. Number one, whenever he is entrusted, he betrays, proves dishonest. It says, whenever he speaks, he tells a lie. Number three, whenever he makes a covenant, he proves treacherous. Number four, whenever he quarrels, he behaves in a very imprudent, evil, and insulting manner. Allahu Akbar. When he argues, when he debates, for, against, praising, dispraising, he curses, he slanders, he growls, and he spits. He has to insult people, call them names. You're this, and you're that, and you're this, and you're that, and you're this, and you're that. When the only thing that you have to do, akhi, is sit down, let's have a discussion. Let's have a debate. Let's talk about the issue. Tafaddal. Bring your proof, your evidence. I'll bring my proof of evidence. This is what the kitab says, the sunnah says, the ijma says. This is what the ulama, the imams of the past say, the imams of the present. What seems to be closest to the kitab and sunnah makes the most sense. What is strongest? What's more authentic? What's more relative? More practical? So on and so forth. And let's come to a conclusion. If you're right, alhamdulillah, jazakallahu khairan. If I'm right, alhamdulillah. If I have to recant, I recant. If you recant, you recant. If we both have our ways and our opinions, we can't see eye to eye, la bas. But why is there need to insult me, to belittle me, to call me names? Why is that your staple practice? Every single opponent of this sheikh and of this scholar is welled upon, as we say, with a torrent of curse and slander. All types of major titles and labels are given to this person. He's harmful than shaitan and iblis, the Dajjal, the Jews, the Christians. We haven't seen a fitna like him since the fitna of Fulan, and this and that, and this and that, and this and that. People, they start to talk about how a person looks. They start talking about a person's lineage, how a person's Arabic. He looks like this, he talks like that, he's from here, he's not even really an Arab. What is this? Is this the behavior of a Muslim? Let alone a scholar, let alone an imam. That can't be the case. And the Prophet ﷺ says this is from the signs of nifaq. That when he argues, he has to slander and insult. Someone refutes you, someone goes against you, someone points out some of your mistakes, some of your errors that are scientifically proven, and you slander him and insult him and call him funny names and talk about his lineage and his ancestry. That can't be the characteristics of a true scholar, let alone an imam in the deen. May Allah help us all. So this hadith, we want to read some commentary, inshallah, on it, whereas we try to diversify the style. An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says here in the sharh of Sahih Muslim, هذا الحديث مما عده جماعة من العلماء مشكلة من حيث أن هذه الخصال توجد في المسلم المصدق الذي ليس فيه شك. وقد أجمع العلماء على أن من كان مصدقا بقلبه ولسانه وفعل هذه الخصال لا يحكم عليه بكفر ولا هو منافق يخلد في النار، فإن إخوة يوسف صلى الله عليه وسلم جمعوا هذه الخصال، وكذا وجد لبعض السلف والعلماء بعض هذا أو كل. He says here وجد أو كله، وهذا الحديث ليس فيه بحمد الله تعالى إشكال ولكن اختلف العلماء في معناه. Listen carefully to what Nawawi says. He says this hadith is considered to be problematic by many scholars. Many of the ulama, they hold the view that it is problematic, it's polemic. And that is because all of the people of knowledge agree that those who believe with their hearts and confess it with their tongues and they perform some of these haram acts are not considered to be kuffar, nor will they dwell in the hellfire forever. He says that all of the ulama, they unanimously agree that if a Muslim makes a promise and breaks it, he's not a kafir. If a Muslim tells lies, he's not a kafir. If a Muslim breaks his amana, he's not a kafir. If a Muslim slanders and insults, he's not a kafir. He says this because this was found in the brethren of Yusuf. His brothers, they lied to their father. They made a plot. They were treacherous. They were in charge of Yusuf, so on and so forth. And they weren't considered to be kuffar. Listen carefully to what Nawawi says. He says, and similarly, some of these traits and characteristics were found in some of the Salaf. And Nawawi says this, not Muhammad ibn Munir. He says that there was some acts of nifaq among some of the pious predecessors. And based off what Nawawi is saying here, this shows us is that there was no individual tabi'i whose statement and whose actions was absolute proof and infallible and irrefutable. No. But what's meant by the way of the Salaf was the ijma' of the Salaf. The overwhelming majority of them, if not all of them, or all of them, if not the overwhelming majority, what they came together collectively as far as the view of one tabi'i, the view of one sahabi, then that is scientifically incorrect to say the way of the Salaf. It's very, very bad. Many people that make this mistake. Let alone the opinion of one scholar, the opinion of an imam that came after the Salaf, let alone those who are alive today. That's wrong. You cannot say that. One sheikh gives a ruling on someone or something, say, this is the way of the ulama. One tabi'i holds a view on an issue to say, this is the fahm salaf. That's a ghalat. It's wrong. He says, and even some of the ulama, they have some of these characteristics. Is what Noe says. If a person said this today in 2016, they would say, he's slanderous of the ulama. If they would say that this alim behaves like this alim says something one day and then breaks his word the next day. We have him recorded saying this and he says, I never said it. He lies. He didn't say, I forgot. He didn't say, I can't remember. He says, no, you're lying. The student is lying. The da'i is lying. Or another scholar, he's lying on me. Yeah, Sheikh, we have you recorded here. There are witnesses who heard you say it. They recorded you in the lecture. He says, kadhab. An-Nawawi rahimahullah, he says that some of these characteristics were found among some of the Salaf and among some of the ulama. And they weren't, he says, some of these characteristics, while the other, he says all. He says some of them or all of them. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. He says, and it's not considered, or they were not considered to be kuffar and munafiqeen. So he says, however, the hadith is not actually problematic. It can be easily understood and broken down in several different ways of interpretation. فالذي قاله المحققون والأكثرون وهو الصحيح والمختار أن معناه أن هذه الخصال خصال النفاق وصاحبها شبيه بالمنافقين في هذه الخصال ومتخلق بأخلاقهم فإن النفاق هو إظهار ما يبطن خلافه وهذا المعنى موجود في صاحب هذه الخصال ويكون نفاقه في حق من حدثه ووعده وائتمنه وخاصمه وعاهده من الناس لا أنه منافق في الإسلام فيظهر أو فيظهره وهو يبطن الكفر ولم يرد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه أو بهذا أنه منافق نفاق الكفار المخلدين في الدرك الأسفل من النار. He says here, the strongest view and the soundest interpretation of this hadith that is held by the muhaqqiqun, the erudite scholars, the strong ulama with strong, clear vision. He says here, and also those, he says, wal-aktharun, most of them. He says here, is that these characteristics are characteristics of hypocrisy. And anyone who has one of them, or all of them, has resembled the munafiqeen, wal-iyadhu billah. He's a copycat of the hypocrites. He's like them. Not necessarily munafiq, but he is what? Shabihun, he says. Similar to them, wal-iyadhu billah. And he has their akhlaq. He has their conduct. And that is because nifaq is for a person to manifest contrast to what he hides, or to hide contrast to what he manifests. He says here, moving on, he says the Prophet did not mean that the person is a munafiq who lies, who breaks his promise, who doesn't fulfill the amana, so on and so forth. He says that's not what he meant, and that he'll be with the kuffar and the munafiqeen in the lowest part of the hellfire. وقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من كان منافقا خالصا معناه شديد الشبه أو الشبه بالمنافقين بسبب هذه الخصال. قال بعض العلماء وهذا في من كانت هذه الخصال غالبة عليه، فأما من يندر ذلك منه فليس داخلا فيه، فهذا هو المختار في معنى الحديث. النووي رحمه الله تعالى then says, and when the Prophet ﷺ says, those people who have all four, he says, then they're pure munafiqeen, a pure hypocrite. He says what's meant by this. He says those Muslims or those people who, or upon whom these characteristics are dominant. Every time he talks, he lies. Every time he's trusted, he breaks it. He's treacherous. He's slanderous, etc. All of the time. He says, as for those who do it from time to time, who fall into it from time to time, so on and so forth, he says, la, that's not what's meant. And this is very dangerous, because there are many of us like this. We're known to be liars. There are many of us known to be slanderous. Many of us are known to be untrustworthy. Many of us who are known backstabbers. Many of us who are known to curse and insult people when we have a disagreement with them. An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he then says, فَهَذَا هُوَ الْمُخْتَارِ, he says this is the correct meaning of this hadith. وَقَدْ نَقَلَ الْإِمَامُ أَبُو عِيسَى التِّرْمِذِي رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ مَعْنَاهُ عَنِ الْعُلَمَاءِ مُطْلَقًا. And this view was also narrated and mentioned by at-Tirmidhi, stating that this was the view of the ulama. Period. He then says, rahimahullah ta'ala, فَقَالَ إِنَّمَا مَعْنَى هَذَا عِنْدَ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ نِفَاقُ الْعَمَلِ. He says this only means nifaq of action. At-Tirmidhi, he says this. And At-Tirmidhi died hundreds of years before Nawawi. And At-Tirmidhi was one of the direct disciples of Imam al-Bukhari. And he's from the tariqah, or upon the tariqah of the way of Ahl al-Hadith. He's quoting from the ulama who came before him. So he's giving you a pure source now. Pure source. At-Tirmidhi then says, وقال جماعة من العلماء المراد به المنافقون الذين كانوا في زمن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. And some of the people of knowledge, they say, what's meant by this? Were the munafiqeen in the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. He says, فَحَدَّثُوا بِإِيمَانِهِمْ وَكَذَبُوا. They spoke about the iman even though they were lying. وَأْتُمِنُوا عَلَى دِينِهِمْ فَخَانُوا. They were entrusted with their religion and they were treacherous. وَوَعَدُوا فِي أَمْرِ الدِّينِ وَنَصْرِهِ فَأَخْلَفُوا. And they promised to protect the religion, to support the Prophet, to give him allegiance, to defend him, to defend Islam, to spread Islam, and they didn't uphold that promise. وَفَجَرُوا فِي خُصُومَاتِهِمْ. And they were wicked when they had arguments and debates over land, over property, marriage, divorce, children, gold coins, dirham, dinar. They were wicked. They made up testimonies, they brought fake witnesses, slandered, attacked the people unjustly. They were wicked. Fajaru. He then says, rahimahullah, وهذا قول سعيد بن جبير وعطاء بن أبي رباح ورجع عليه الحسن البصري بعد أن كان على خلافه وهو مروي عن ابن عباس وابن عمر رضي الله عنهم وروي أيضا عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أو روي أيضا عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He then says, Nawawi, he then says, here, يعني, he says, this is the statement of Sa'id ibn Jubair, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, and it was the last view of Al-Hasan al-Basri, even though he held a different view in the beginning. And this is mentioned from Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, and also from the Prophet, not necessarily saying this authentic, but it says ruya. He then says here, رحمه الله تعالى, قال القاضي عياض رحمه الله وإليه مال كثير من أئمتنا. Al-Qadi Iyad from the Shurrah, those who explain Sahih Muslim before Nawawi, he says this was the view of most of our Imams, yani the Maliki Imams. He then says, and Nawawi Shafi'i, goes to show you that bigotry of the people today is baseless. The Shafi'i alim benefited and quoted from a Maliki alim, not like the ignorant fools today. They only quote from the ulama of their madhab. Most people are like this today, unfortunately. He says, rahimahullah, وحكى الخطابي رحمه الله قولا آخر أن معناه تحذير للمسلم أن يعتاد هذه الخصال التي يخاف عليه أن تفضي به إلى حقيقة النفاق. Al-Khattabi rahimahullah, from the ulama who came before Nawawi as well, he said that there's another meaning for this hadith, and that is a warning, tahdhir, to warn the Muslim to constantly practice these acts and these characteristics. And if he continues to lie, continues to behave like this, break his promise, deny fulfilling the aman and things like this, that it would lead him to the actual nifaq, wal-iyadhu billah. It would lead him to the actual major kufr with his heart. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. And before we went any further, this style of interpretation here is very similar to the hadiths on not making salah. Some of the ulama, not all of them, and this is not my view, we're not here arguing and debating on this view, okay? I'm not saying it is my view or it isn't my view, but we're making a point. Some of them, they say that this is what's meant by those who do not pray. فَقَدْ كَفَرَ. He who doesn't pray has made kufr. In other words, he has imitated the kuffar, and not making salah is going to lead him to not having iman at all. It's going to lead him to kufr. Some of the scholars of Islam, they say that's the interpretation of those hadiths. And obviously, some of the ulama, they say what? They say differently. Khairan, inshallah, moving forward. وحكى الخطابي رحمه الله أيضا عن بعضهم أن الحديث ورد في رجل بعينه منافق وكان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يواجههم بصريح القول فيقول فلان منافق وإنما كان يشير إشارة كقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما بال أقوام يفعلون كذا والله أعلم. He then says here, Al-Khattabi also says that some people say another interpretation, and that was that the Prophet ﷺ, he only said this hadith regarding a man specifically one man, one munafiq that he knew of. Khayr, inshallah. Regardless what this or that, these are the different styles of the ulama, and it's always a benefit for the student of knowledge, for the hadith disciple, even for the layman Muslim, to understand these different views and having the richness of the hadith culture. The richness of the hadith culture. He says, whereas the Prophet ﷺ, he never would address the munafiqeen directly by name like this, and there were many other people that made sins and things like this that he wouldn't speak to directly, but he would say, why are people doing this, why are people doing that, so on and so forth. In contrast to many people today, unfortunately, who are in love with names. Okay? Not saying that it's haram to mention a person's name when there's a need, when there's a necessity, when there's a major benefit. Not saying that. But those, as we said, who are just crazed about names. Everybody's name has to be mentioned. There's never a time in which the name is not mentioned. There's always mention on the minbar, in the class, in the book, on the website. Name by name. That's obviously not the way as well. Okay? He says here, وأما قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم في رواية الأولى أربع من كن في كان منافق في الرواية الأخرى آية المنافق ثلاث فلا منافاة بينهما فإن الشيء الواحد قد تكون علامات كل واحدة منهن تحصل بها صفته ثم قد تكون تلك العلامة شيئا واحدا وقد تكون أشياء والله أعلم. He then speaks on the concept of one narration says 4 and one narration says 3. He says there's no contradiction between the two. Khayr, inshallah. Moving forward, this hadith teaches us first and foremost is that there is a thing of nifaq, a thing called nifaq. And the Muslim has to beware of it, from it. He has to be careful, not falling into it. This hadith teaches us a person can have a trait or attribute of nifaq without not actually being a munafiq. This hadith also teaches us the impermissibility of lying. It teaches us the virtue of telling the truth. It teaches us the harm of breaking one's word, not keeping your promise, not fulfilling your amana. And it also teaches us the harm of behaving like a fajr, a wicked, foul man at the time of argument and debate. Even if you're right, even if the haqq is with you, you're not to behave like that, ya akhi. And this also goes to show us how far many people are from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Even if you're right in your refutation, it's unnecessary for you to behave like this. Even if you're right in what you're saying, you can't belittle a Muslim like that. And you're not allowed to make up false things, inaccuracies, and throw them in there because he's a deviant. So I'm not even going to verify the rest of the information because he's a deviant. Because he's an innovator, so you might as well lie on him. And everybody come on and jump on top of him. La, what is this? That's wrong. That's not the way. Khair, inshallah. Let's move forward. He says here, Hadith Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, and the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam قال آية المنافق ثلاث إذا حدث كذب وإذا وعد أخلف وإذا اؤتمن خان. Hadith number 38 is reported by Abu Hurairah. Hadith 37 is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. He says the signs of a munafiq are 3. When he speaks, he lies. When he makes a promise, he breaks it. And when he's trusted, he behaves treacherously, as we've explained. Let's move on to the next chapter. It says chapter number 34, Babu bayani hali imani man qala li akhihi ya kafir. The mention about the state of belief of a person who calls his brother, Muslim brother, as a disbeliever. Hadith Abdullah ibn Umar radhiyallahu anhuma anna Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam qala أيما رجل قال لأخيه يا كافر فقد باء بها أحدهما. Hadith number 39, narrated Abdullah ibn Umar radhiyallahu anhuma, Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if anyone says to his brother, O disbeliever, then surely one of them is such. Inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in our next class, we will explain the chapter heading and the hadith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surely knows best.